Hey students, sorry I'm not there to do this lesson with you in person, but today you're going to be learning about the rest of World War II. We've already covered the war in the Pacific, the war in Europe, and we covered the home front yesterday. So today you're going to be learning the other parts of the war, which I think you'll find just as interesting. Have a great day. We're going to be in standards E and F today, so let's get started. Make sure you have your notes out. All right, so standard 11 E and F. Standard 11E is the Holocaust. And this is a topic I'm sure you've learned about time and time again in school. The Holocaust, of course, was instituted in Nazi Germany, but also other parts of Europe where um, Jews lived. And we are going to first talk about what the term genocide means. It says the Nazis targeted specific groups for genocide to create a master race. So, genocide, if you're unfamiliar with the term genocide, one hint for you all is to look at the suffix and prefix. The prefix gen, you may think of words like generation, genealogy, genes, okay? And that's referring to a specific group of people. Okay, we pass down genes from generation to generation. Generations refers to a group that lives in a particular time. Genes are things we inherit from our parents and their parents and so on. The suffix cide, side, you can think about words like homicide. Okay, um, words like homicide, CIDE means to kill. So when we're looking at the word genocide, we're referring to a plan to kill a specific group of people. And this is a deliberate attempt to wipe out an entire group, whether it's a racial group, ethnic group, religious group. Um, these are genocides. And genocide does not stop or start with the Holocaust. Sometimes people think the Holocaust is the only genocide that has happened. That's not true. There have been other genocides throughout history. The Holocaust is the most well known of these, but in modern history, it's happened through the Ottoman Empire on the Armenian people. It happened in the Soviet Union in the same time period as the Holocaust. It happened in Cambodia. It happened in Rwanda, and it's happened, and it's still going on because of these horrible ideas people have of certain people being inferior to others. The Nazis wanted to create a master race. The cartoon and on the slide shows the type of person they thought was the perfect type of human being, which would be a person with blonde hair and blue eyes. And although all Germans didn't fit that phenotype, what their ultimate goal was to wipe out undesirable people and eventually breed a master race of people that looked like this. So the Holocaust is part of what was called the final solution. The whole term of exterminating a group of people, when you think of exterminate, I'm sure that makes you think of bugs or other types of creatures that you may not want in your home. Well, they used this term to refer to people they didn't want. So the extermination of the Jewish population through this genocide was called the final solution. Now, although Jews were the main target of this genocide, they were not the only targets. Other targets include people who were Polish, Poles, Slavic people, Slavs, so Eastern Europeans, Gypsies, we today call the Roma people, homosexuals, the mentally ill, physically disabled people were also targeted. And another religious group that was targeted as well were Jehovah's Witnesses. So there was various groups of people, including political opponents like communists, who were targeted by the Nazis in Europe. So as we learned in class Monday, Germans conducted what was called a blitzkrieg or lightning war, and they occupied most of Europe. So that meant that these ideas didn't just stay in Germany, they spread throughout Europe. On the next slide, we're going to look at some quotes from people who um, were, um, three of them were Holocaust survivors, and one of them perished in the Holocaust. Let's look at these four quotes. First one on the top left: no matter your race, religion, belief system, or gender, humans have to be treated equally. Going down to the bottom left, this quote is from probably one of the most well-known Holocaust survivors who passed away a few years ago. His name was Elie Wiesel, and he wrote the book Night. He said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." In the bottom right, we have this quote: "We have to prevent similar atrocities from happening again. People should come together the moment there is danger. Endangering one group means endangering all of us." And then we also have hope from Anne Frank. Many of you probably read The Diary of Anne Frank, or at least heard of it. And of course, after her family was captured in the Netherlands in the attic they had been hiding in, she ended up dying at a concentration camp. Her last diary entry was, "Despite everything, I believe that people are really good at heart." So that gives us hope. Even though these horrible things have happened, um, these quotes give us hope that we have to work against and fight against this type of hatred that led to the Holocaust and leads to other genocides and other forms of discrimination around the world. We're going to look at a brain pop video about the Holocaust.
It's a memorial for the people who died in the Holocaust. Dear Tim and Moby, how did the Holocaust happen? From Dora. The Holocaust was the systematic murder of 6 million Jews during World War II. It seems impossible to imagine how human beings could do such terrible things. But it didn't just happen out of the blue. The path to genocide began years before the killing started. Genocide is when one group of people tries to wipe out another group because of who they are. In the Holocaust, the Nazis were trying to eliminate all Jews. The Nazis were a German political party whose leader was Adolf Hitler. In the 1920s and 30s, they rose to power by promising to restore Germany to its former glory. The country had suffered a humiliating defeat in World War I. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression, a global economic collapse, dealt the Germans another blow. Formerly a world power, Germany was on the verge of total collapse. Hitler and the Nazis insisted that the nation could regain its greatness. They said true Germans were part of a superior race, which was destined to rule the world. They just had to destroy the enemy secretly undermining them from within. That enemy, according to the Nazis, was the Jews. This anti-Semitism, racism against Jews, fueled the Nazis' rise to power. Anti-Semitism has a long history in Europe. Going back to the Middle Ages, Jews were viewed with suspicion for not following Christianity. Their differences made them targets of prejudice and violence. By the 20th century, most people thought that Europe had left that past behind, especially Germany. It was a center of modern thought and culture. The Nazis stirred up old prejudices with anti-Semitic propaganda, using newspapers, movies, and other mass media to push a particular message. They depicted Jews as rats or insects, blood-sucking enemies weakening Germany. The goal was to convince German citizens to turn on their neighbors, and it worked. In the 1932 election, the Nazi Party won a third of the seats in parliament. Within a year, Adolf Hitler was appointed the leader of Germany. 1 month later, someone burned down the Reichstag, the German parliament building. No one really knows who set the fire, but Hitler used it to seize more power. He blamed his party's political opponents and had them arrested. Citing national security, Hitler abolished freedom of speech, protest, and the press. He became the country's dictator, or absolute ruler. His personal security force, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, became the country's national police. They built large outdoor prisons called concentration camps because they concentrated large groups of people in one place. These were used to jail political enemies of the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, Hitler's regime began stripping Jewish citizens of their civil rights. Jews were banned from serving in the army and government and as doctors. Quotas, or limits, were placed on the number of Jewish students. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws defined German and Jew as different races. One law stated that only people of German blood could be citizens of Germany, and only citizens had political rights. The Roma Sinti, another ethnic minority, were targets of similar regulations. Other laws singled out gay people, communists, and the disabled. Anyone who didn't fit the Nazi idea of the master race. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars so people would know who to target. And citizens were encouraged to harass and attack them on the streets. On November 9, 1938, violence exploded in a wave of attacks. It looked like a riot had just suddenly happened. But we now know that it was secretly led by SS officers acting on specific orders. Many wore regular clothes to blend in with the crowd. Neighbors joined in to destroy Jewish-owned shops, burn synagogues, and murder 90 Jews. Another 30,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It was called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Many Jews had already left Germany. After Kristallnacht, more and more tried to escape. They sought safety in other countries, at embassies, and at the borders. Most were turned away. The U.S. refused to change its laws to allow more European Jews to move here. Countries around the world expressed sympathy, but kept their doors closed. In May of 1939, a ship called the St. Louis arrived in Cuba. It carried 900 Jewish refugees from Germany, all with legal entry visas. But at the last minute, Cuba denied them entry. The U.S. turned them away too, and so did Canada. Captain Gustav Schroeder refused to return to Germany until his passengers found safe harbor. Eventually, they were divided among France, Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, touching off World War II. Within a year, most of Europe was under German control. This brought the fates of millions more Jews into the hands of the Nazis, including those who thought they had escaped, like the passengers from the St. Louis. Jews were stripped of their property and forced into ghettos, walled-off sections of cities. Conditions were extremely crowded, with little food and almost no medicine. From there, they were shipped off to a vast network of concentration camps. The Nazis now had hundreds of these prisons across Europe. Prisoners spent their days doing hard labor, and their nights crammed into unheated sheds. They died by the thousands from torture, disease, and starvation. Well, for the Nazis, none of this went far enough. So Hitler's administration devised a final solution: total extermination. Families were rounded up and shot by the thousands. And in late 1941, the Nazis began to build death camps with gas chambers. These were airtight rooms that were filled with deadly poisonous gas. Prisoners were told they were showers, but the shower heads poured gas, not water. By the end of the war, the Nazis had killed 6 million Jews, plus 5 million others. When the Allies won the war, the camps were liberated. Photographs of skeletal survivors gas chambers, smokestacks, and piles of bodies shocked the world. People struggled to comprehend the scale of the Nazis' crimes. Party leaders were prosecuted at a special court in the German city of Nuremberg. Accusing them of murder didn't seem big enough to fit their crimes, so they were charged with a new category of offense: crimes against humanity. The newly formed United Nations took steps to prevent another Holocaust. Its countries agreed to work together to root out and punish genocide, and to welcome immigrants fleeing from violence. Tragically, genocides do still happen around the world, and governments rarely act in time to stop them. But as individuals, we can push our leaders to do something when we see the warning signs. When a society decides that only certain people belong and others are the enemy. When one group of people is labeled animals or a disease. When people are denied their rights and cut off from society. When they're victimized just because of who they are. We know where that can lead. And we all have a responsibility to stop it.
Right, so hopefully that brain pop video helped you understand some things that maybe you have some questions about regarding the Holocaust. We're now looking at, and you don't have to write the second bullet point down, but the first bullet point talks about the Nuremberg trials, and the video just did tell you all about it. The whole concept of charging people with the term called crimes against humanity was a very revolutionary concept. And these trials took place in Nuremberg, Germany, because that was really the only major city that hadn't been destroyed during the war. A precedent or standard that this series of trials set was that we as individuals are responsible for what we do. We just can't say we're following orders when we do atrocious, horrible things to other people. So that's really one of the greatest legacies of these trials. We're accountable for what we've done. Right, so we're going to watch a short video now on the Nuremberg trials. Then we'll talk a little bit about the second bullet point.
The Nuremberg trials are remarkable in many ways. Until then, war crimes or crimes against humanity were not clearly defined legally or not defined at all. At the same time, however, the defendants were to be granted a fair trial in accordance with the rule of law, while the global public was to be educated on the crimes of the National Socialist regime, and a legal foundation for dealing with future wars was to be established. Additionally, for the first time in history, leading members of a government were put on trial before an international court. The major war criminals trial against 21 high-ranking representatives of the Nazi regime was held from November 20th, 1945 until 1946 in the courtroom 600 of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. The so-called follow-up trials were concluded in 1949. For the first trial, 4 judges and 4 alternate judges of the Allied powers were to determine the personal guilt of the defendants and find an adequate sentence. The indictments referred to crimes unprecedented in scale. These were, among others, planning and waging a war of annihilation, systematic mass murder, displacing civilian populations, and the destruction of entire cities. The task of the 4 prosecution teams was not an easy one. Even though the crimes of the Germans during the Second World War were committed for the whole world to see, were well documented, and there were many witnesses, a conviction was uncertain because the legal foundation for the trials had only been created with the London Charta and had not yet been proven. The trials were therefore especially important in order to find a legal response for crimes committed during the war. The different sentences then made it very clear that the trials were not about taking revenge, but about judging the crimes based on the existing documents and depositions. This notion is further supported in the defense counsel. All of them did their job voluntarily and had different reasons for participating in the trials. And last but not least, the press has to be mentioned. From the beginning, the Allies were aware of its importance. In order to secure the coverage of the trial that would be as complete as possible, office space, accommodation, and additional seats were created for the media representatives. And the demand was high. Reporters from over 20 nations took part and produced content for newspapers, the radio, and even film. This was done for the global public to enable it to form a detailed opinion of the trials and all of those involved. But there's another particularity to be mentioned. Due to the internationality of the trials, for the first time ever, a team of female and male interpreters simultaneously translated into all the relevant languages. A very difficult task, considering that many interpreters were themselves affected by the war. Despite the overwhelming media response and the pioneering role of the trials, for example, for the International Criminal Court in The Hague, it would be wrong to call them a success story only. Although most states today are committed to human rights and international law, the implementation of these principles is often challenged by foreign policy and the interests of individual states. This makes it all the more important to continue the public conversation about the Nuremberg trials and their significance in the future. And that is exactly what the exhibition at the Memoriam Nuremberg Trials does.
All right, so let's look at the previous slide again and look at the second bullet point. So after World War II was over, so many Jewish people have been displaced all around the world. Many of them had lost their entire families and had lost their homes, of course. They had lost their wealth. And so there was an increasing demand for a Jewish homeland to be established. And that eventually led to the creation of the State of Israel. So after World War II ended, that led to the establishment of Israel 3 years later on May 14th, 1948. And the State of Israel was established in Palestine, where that, of course, is what's called the Holy Land to most monotheistic religions. And, all right, Standard 11F, which is on the back, talks about the treatment of Japanese civilians, Japanese American civilians after the war. So, as we recall from our lesson Monday, and our lesson yesterday, we first of all do understand that the United States entered World War II as a result of the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. After that attack, we know that many Japanese American young men who were born in the United States, the Nisei, joined the fight because they wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States, and they fought bravely and were highly decorated group of young men. We also learned yesterday that we were still living, of course, in a time period of segregation. So there should not be a surprise to us that Japanese Americans were targeted. And because of their ancestry, many of them living on the West Coast were relocated. They were forced to sell their property. They were forced to leave their homes and go to the deserted places of the United States and live in internment camps. So as you can see, the sign that's on the slide says, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following area. So they have a list and they're telling them that they're going to have to leave and relocate. There was strong anti-Japanese prejudice and fear because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. And so this anger was taken out on these people. So even though they were American citizens, they were forced to leave and live on these camps. One of the young men living on the West Coast was named Fred Korematsu. And he wanted to stay with his girlfriend, and the video is going to go in more detail about this. He actually had even some cosmetic surgery, but that didn't hide the fact that people could tell he was of Asian descent. And he did not want to leave. His case goes to the Supreme Court, Korematsu versus the United States, and he loses this case. We're going to watch this video to explain what happened during this case.
Mr. Beat presents Supreme Court Briefs. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, December 7th, 1941.
December 7th, 1941.
Yeah. Japan drops bombs on an American naval base, killing more than 2,400 Americans and injuring 1,000 more. In response, the United States declares war on Japan, officially entering World War II. Increasingly, Americans viewed anyone of Japanese heritage suspiciously. Japanese Americans had already faced racism and discrimination in the country for nearly 100 years. After the Pearl Harbor attack, that racism and discrimination went to the next freaking level, as many thought Japanese Americans might be more loyal to Japan than the United States, sharing military secrets with them and stuff, or trying to sabotage the war effort. Despite there being no evidence whatsoever that this was happening, Japanese American persecution increased. People bought Jap hunting licenses. Life magazine published an article illustrating how to tell the difference between a Japanese person and a Chinese person by the shape of their nose and height. In California, the racism and paranoia seemed to be worse. A barber shop there advertised, quote, free shaves for Japs, with a disclaimer that read, quote, not responsible for accidents. A funeral parlor advertised, quote, I'd rather do business with a Jap than an American. Several people called for removing all Japanese Americans from Western states and forcing them to live in concentration camps somewhere else. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had a record of being racist against the Japanese, agreed with this idea. He signed Executive Order 9066. It ordered the roundup of 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent to one of 10 concentration camps, officially called, quote, relocation centers. It also said Japanese Americans weren't allowed to be in California at all, as well as much of Oregon, Washington, and Arizona, unless they were in one of the camps, of course. Fred Korematsu was one of the Japanese Americans who said the heck with Executive Order 9066. He stayed in California. He had a girlfriend who was not Japanese American there he didn't want to leave, and just thought Roosevelt's order was wrong. So after his entire family left for one of the camps, he stayed behind, became a welder, and tried not to stand out too much. He changed his name and got a fake ID. Later, he even tried to have plastic surgery on his eyes to look less Japanese. The plastic surgeon who worked on him didn't do the procedure, but took his money anyway. Shortly after this, someone reported him and he was arrested. After his arrest, he never saw his girlfriend again, by the way. Eventually, Korematsu found himself in federal prison. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, reached out to him there and offered to represent him in court. Korematsu said, heck yeah. Together they argued that Executive Order 9066 went against the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Korematsu's loyalty to the United States was never in question. Still, in federal court in San Francisco, he was convicted, given 5 years of probation, and sent to a concentration camp in Utah. He appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals, who agreed with the lower court. He then appealed again, and the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, hearing arguments in October 1944, with the war still raging on. During arguments, the court considered a similar case from the previous year called Hirabayashi v. United States. That one 1 upheld Executive Order 9066, the court announced its decision on December 18, 1944. It sided with the United States, but this one was certainly controversial. It was 6-3. The court argued that Executive Order 9066 was justified in order to keep the country safe. They said the need to protect Americans from espionage was more important than individual rights. Justice Hugo Black wrote the opinion, but today most say the opinion is pretty flawed. He wrote, quote, "Korematsu was not excluded from the military area because of hostility to him or his race. He was excluded because we are at war with the Japanese Empire," unquote. Actually, no, that is false. He also wrote, quote, "There was evidence of disloyalty on the part of some Japanese Americans. The military authorities considered that the need for action was great and the time was short," unquote. You're 0 for 2, Hugo. At the time, there was no evidence of that either. Justice Felix Frankfurter chimed in that the Constitution gave the President and Congress these war powers. The 3 justices who dissented all wrote separate opinions. Justice Frank Murphy passionately argued that the decision was basically the legalization of racism and that this racial discrimination went against everything the United States stood for. Quote, "All residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood or culture to a foreign land, yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization of the United States. They must, accordingly, be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment, and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution," unquote. Dang, you tell him, Frank. On January 2nd, 1945, President Roosevelt canceled Executive Order 9066. The camps were shut down, and many Japanese Americans returned home to find their belongings missing or destroyed. Fred Korematsu returned home and did not speak publicly about the case for decades. Flash forward to the 1980s. By this time, most Americans agreed that what the government did to Japanese Americans during World War II was messed up. In 1983, Korematsu's original conviction was finally overturned. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized to the Japanese Americans affected and awarded payments of $20,000 to each camp survivor, about $43,000 in today's money. Korematsu did speak out in his later years. He died in 2005. In 2009, a nonprofit civil liberties organization called the Fred T. Korematsu Institute was founded. It's currently ran by Fred's daughter, Karen Korematsu. Korematsu v. United States is often considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. Today, the case, as well as the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, are both seen as major tragedies. On June 26, 2018, in the case Trump v. Hawaii, a case which upheld the president's restriction of travel in the United States by people from several countries, the Supreme Court finally, officially overruled the Korematsu decision.
Okay, so I think Mr. Beats described it in very great detail. All right, the next topic is the issue of prisoners of war, also standard 11F. The savagery of war and indecency were prevalent during World War II. So we just talked about the Holocaust, talked about Japanese internment. So we know that a lot of bad things happened to many people who were not fighting in the war. It was bad enough for those who were fighting, and also bad for many who were not fighting. So what about those who are fighting in the war? The Geneva Convention had established what were the rules of war. You realize that you cannot just do anything you want to just because you are at war with them. And so what are the rules of war? I really enjoy this video because I think it really explains it in a very unique way.
Since the beginning, humans have resorted to violence as a way to settle disagreements. Yet through the ages, people from around the world have tried to limit the brutality of war. It was this humanitarian spirit that led to the first Geneva Convention of 1864 and to the birth of modern international humanitarian law. Setting the basic limits on how wars can be fought, These universal laws of war protect those not fighting, as well as those no longer able to. To do this, a distinction must always be made between who or what may be attacked and who or what must be spared and protected. Most importantly, civilians can never be targeted. To do so is a war crime.
When they drove into our village, they shouted that they were going to kill everyone. I was so scared. I ran to hide in the bush. I heard my mother screaming. I thought I would never see her again.
Every possible care must be taken to avoid harming civilians or destroying things essential for their survival. They have a right to receive the help they need.
The conditions prisoners lived in never used to bother me. People like him were the reason my brother was dead. He was the enemy and was nothing to me. But then I realized that behind bars, he was out of action and no longer a threat to me and my family.
The laws of war prohibit torture and other ill treatment of detainees, whatever their past. They must be given food and water and allowed to communicate with loved ones. This preserves their dignity and keeps them alive. Medical workers save lives, sometimes in the most dangerous conditions.
Fighters from both sides were wounded in a deadly battle. We were taking them to the nearest hospital. At a checkpoint, a soldier threatened us to treat his men only. We were running out of time, and I was afraid that now all of them were going to die.
Medical workers must always be allowed to do their job, and the Red Cross or Red Crescent must not be attacked. The sick or wounded have a right to be cared for, regardless of whose side they are on. Advances in weapons technology have meant that the rules of war have also had to adapt. Because some weapons and methods of warfare don't distinguish between fighters and civilians, limits on their use have been agreed. In the future, wars may be fought with fully autonomous robots. But will such robots ever have the ability to distinguish between a military target and someone who must never be attacked? No matter how sophisticated weapons become, it is essential that they are in line with the rules of war. International humanitarian law is all about making choices that preserve a minimum of human dignity in times of war and make sure that living together again is possible once the last bullet has been shot.
The last section in our World War II unit talks about the Bataan Death March, which was one of the most horrible examples of Japanese brutality during World War II. The following is an interview with a survivor of that march.
It was called a death march not because of how many died. Of the 12,000 Americans, only about 1,700 lived to come home. But they called it a death march because of the way they died. If you stopped on the road, you were killed. If you had a malaria attack, they killed you. If you had to stop to defecate, they killed you. If you just couldn't take another step, they killed you. And how did they kill you? They'd either bayonet you to death, shoot you, or in some cases decapitate you. They did not give us water. They gave us no food. the temperature was about 108 degrees. The Americans that were captured, a good 80% of them had malaria, another 50% had dysentery. So we were gunshot wounds, malaria, dysentery, and we had to walk this distance that they wanted us to. Under these conditions, it was unbearable. I think that what kept me going is this: about the second day, I made the decision that the only way I was going to survive was if I started to set goals for myself. And I would walk and I would see a herd of caribou in the distance. And I would say to myself, I must get to that herd of caribou. I didn't know where they were. I didn't know how far they were. I didn't know how many days it was going to take me or how many hours. But I made every effort to get to that herd of caribou, no matter what happened. The Japanese told me to smile, I did. They told me to sit, I sat. They told me to march, I marched. They hit me, it was okay. They broke my nose, knocked my teeth out. They split my head open, but I still had to go to reach those herd of caribou. Then when I got to the herd of caribou, then I'd find another goal, and another goal, and another goal. Every day was another goal. From that day on, I've lived my whole life that way. And those people who hold on to a grudge, I think, have a very different philosophy of life. And that's how they live. By not holding on to a grudge, by being able to roll with the punch, I think it's a lot easier to live. My life is a lot happier because I've learned how to adjust to adversities and how to deal with it.
That concludes our unit on World War II. See you tomorrow.